news broke late yesterday from friend of the show, Shelby Talcott of Semaphore, that the Education Department had taken its first giant leap towards totally shuttering during the Trump administration. We can put C1 up on the screen. Shelby reported, per person familiar, a quote, reduction in force notices for the Education Department are expected to go out today at 6 p.m. Nearly half of the department is expected to be eliminated. Now, if we put C2B up on the screen, this came shortly after that scoop from Shelby. She got the report, she confirmed the report that these notices had gone out. All Education Department offices in D.C. will be closed tomorrow. No reason beyond, quote, for security reasons, and workers were instructed to leave by 6 p.m. today, Shelby reported per a source. She also later reported that the Education Department has confirmed a, quote, reduction in force that will impact nearly 50% of its workforce. Staffers will be placed on administrative leave beginning March 21st. So it's not as though the Education Department is half as full today, this morning, as people are going into the office. It's that they are starting to scale down over the course of the next couple of weeks. And that is, again, a 50% reduction of force at the Department of Education. And Krystal, like you said earlier in the show, all of these blocks could basically have been in a block. This is, obviously very significant news. And I want to get your reaction to this clip of Education Secretary recently confirmed, Linda McMahon on Laura Ingram's show last night, confirming, again, this is the first step on the road to a, quote, total shutdown. Let's roll this next element.
First, welcome to the show, because you haven't been on in studio with me before. Now, is this the first step on the road to a total shutdown?
Yes, actually it is, because that was the president's mandate, his directive to me, clearly is to shut down the Department of Education, which we know we'll have to work with Congress, to get that accomplished. But what we did today was to take the first step of eliminating what I think is bureaucratic bloat. And that's not to say that a lot of the folks, it's a humanitarian thing too. A lot of the folks that are there, they're out of a job. But we wanted to make sure that we kept all of the right people and the good people to make sure that the outward-facing programs, the grants, the appropriations that come from Congress, all of that are being met. And none of that's going to fall through the cracks.
So there it is, Krystal. It's happening, to quote the Ron Paul meme.
Yeah, it's happening so long as federal courts don't intervene and block. Certainly you can't dismantle the entire Education Department without an act of Congress. And even these massive cuts, I think will certainly face court challenges. But, to zoom out here, and Emily, you can speak to this as well, this is a long-time conservative movement priority. I think really going back to the era of, the federal government being directly involved in desegregating schools and the fights over busing. The Department of Education has sort of had a target on its back for much of its history from the right because of those interventions, which, by the way, the times when the federal government has been most involved in public school education are actually some of the times when we've seen some of the best results, especially in terms of Black students and white students' test scores being more equivalent. Back in the 70s in particular, when the federal government was super involved, you saw massive increases in terms of the scores of Black test students. You've seen more controversially in the George W. Bush era, the Republican Party sort of laid down their arms against the Department of Education, took a different tack, decided to be aggressive in terms of pushing sort of increased test standards. This was the era of the bipartisan No Child Left Behind. Obama continued somewhat in that direction. Then there was a bit of a backlash against, we're testing students too much, we need to pull back. And so it's interesting because right now, while the Department of Education is being, attacked and gutted in this way, it's one of the times when it's been less involved in local public school life than it has been at different parts of its history. I think the other way to look at this, and then we can get into more specifically, what does the Department of Education even do? What does most of its funding and personnel go towards? But, conservatives have also long had a political project to push students away from public schools towards private schools, towards charter schools, towards voucher systems, towards homeschooling. And I certainly think that the energy around that was increased significantly by the local reactions and the federal reaction, but specifically the local reactions to COVID and all the school shutdowns and all of the conversation about book bannings and all of those sorts of things. So I think this is right in line with that, right in Project 2025, longtime conservative ideological project. And before I get into sort of like the categories of what the education department actually does, I'd just love for you to, reflect as a conservative how you would situate these moves within the Department of Education.
Yeah, and your point about the history of the education department is really important because I think that was Carter in 1979. Under the Carter administration, I think the education department comes in and Reagan campaigns on getting rid of the education department. So it's kind of interesting because I feel like actually a lot of conservatives would say we want to go back to the education system of the 1970s before so much of this became centralized in Washington, D.C. And this is, of all of the departments that the right wants to eliminate in this like Doge fantasy, this is the one where I think they have the most particular plan as to how to do it. So the explanation would be a lot of the things that the education department does, and we're going to see this in the next element, will still happen. They will just be managed on the state level. Same thing with civil rights, for example, they want to meld that into the Justice Department. So it's not as though some of these things won't continue to happen. It's just that they'll be administered on the state level. But, and this is a huge but, that obviously is dependent on the off-ramp being executed competently and efficiently, to borrow the phrase from Doge. So I think one way to see this is as though you're doing like a life-saving surgery, and you're like, okay, I think this surgery has to happen. That doesn't mean there isn't a significant there isn't a significant chance that it could go very wrong if you take some incorrect steps. I say that as someone, as a conservative who thinks a lot of this should probably go back to the states. I think the plan to house some of this civil rights stuff under the Department of Justice, which is perfectly equipped to handle it, I think that's all great. But if you don't handle the surgery in a competent way, then you're in big trouble. You can essentially make the situation even worse to continue playing out that metaphor. So we could go ahead and put this up on the screen. C4, Krystal, this is a chart that you pulled of the largest spending categories in the Department of Education. So you see a huge chunk of that is federal student aid, so loans and Pell Grants. K-12 education comes in at second, and then early childhood education, a very distant third. Career and technical education, civil rights, and school safety are the lowest category. So Krystal, can you talk to us a little bit about how you see the future of the education department in the context of what that spending looks like as of right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I think it's important to keep the broader ideological goals in mind, which is, number one, I mean, this also fits with the later block about Mahmoud Khalil in that there is an ideological war also against higher education, and they're using this sort of like pro-Palestine movement as a cudgel to hobble universities. And, 60 universities have received letters. So they love the Civil Rights Division of the Education Department when they're weaponizing it to hurt universities and to go after students who were part of the pro-Palestine movement. But so that's part of the ideological project is like this sense of universities are churning out all of these like liberal lefties. We don't like that. So we want to hurt these universities. We'll use whatever pretext we can. And so the efforts Trump has already rolled back some of the student loan relief that has been put into place previously. And certainly this, you can see from that chart, the number one category of spending is actually things like Pell Grants, which make college more affordable for poor students. I think that's a part of the priority. And then I think the other priority is, listen, we're just not really big on public education in general. We think kids should be homeschooled. We think they should have vouchers and go to private schools. We think they should go to charter schools, et cetera. And so there's been a long time also attack on the public education system. I will say, there's some recent historical warnings against aggressively attacking the public school system. In particular, the 2018 teacher strike wave, which was mostly concentrated in red states. And there's a good reason for that. It's because, those states were more rural. And the more rural the area, the more central the public school is to the community. These are, first of all, the teachers and the administrators will be some of the most important people in the community. It will be one of the most important centers of community. I don't remember if it was you or Ryan who was talking about the fact that, like, as church has declined as the pillar of community, and again, this is part of what the right doesn't like about the school, as church has declined, school has become like the sort of central meeting place and gathering point for community and way to be active and involved in community. And so if you are attacking that and people feel like this really important pillar is being stripped back, is really being attacked by the federal government, there is going to be a negative reaction to that, and not just from, liberals in cities. In fact, there'll be some of the people who suffer the least from this because they have the most options in terms of other school choices available to them. In a small town, all you've got is the public school, that's it, or homeschool. And for, if you're both parents are working, whatever, that's just not really a feasible option for you. So I do think there's a lot of political warnings here. But there is no doubt this is a longtime conservative priority. It, to your point, Emily, laid out in Project 2025, which Trump insisted he had nothing to do with and didn't want anything to do with, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we all knew that was a lie the whole time. And now they are acting on that. And I think the only thing that could stop them is potentially a court decision that said, hey, like, these funds have been appropriated, you have to spend them. And by the way, you can't just destroy an entire agency without going to Congress, since this is like a congressionally authorized agency, and you cannot just take the power of the purse for yourself and do whatever you want like you're a king.
Yeah, and I'd argue that the community focus, especially in rural areas, is potentially an upside here, in that you would have state governments who are more responsive to localized concerns, or even paired back to city level governments that are more responsive to localized concerns than the federal government. I think that's been a problem in different cases. But to your point, and to the return to the surgery metaphor, that can obviously go wrong in ways that are politically disastrous for the administration. There's no question about that. And you flagged this is C5, this Politico article about USAID. And USAID is really the momentum, or that's really where the right and the Trump administration is getting its momentum from still, because they felt like they politically prosecuted that case successfully for closing USAID. Now Politico is reporting that an official has told staffers, quote, shred and burn your documents. That's the Politico headline. And so it is sort of interesting that the USAID case is seen as this sort of positive case study for how these political attempts to shut down institutions that have existed for a long time, that Americans are sort of used to, even if they don't think about them very often. When USAID, for example, Elon Musk said, well, we made the mistake with Ebola funding, and people are still upset about how PEPFAR was handled. So these things are enormously fragile, and I think that was part of the reason for Project 2025, interestingly enough, was that they sort of didn't want haphazard approaches to difficult questions. They wanted to, use what was seen as a once-in-a-generation opportunity with political capital and will to start enacting these conservative fantasy lists, like Christmas lists, wish items,
right.
And they wanted it to be done very carefully. And to look at USAID as an example, it makes you wonder what will come out of paring back the Department of Education that will create political obstacles to going about the entire project. I obviously think USAID should be dramatically scaled back and should be a better run organization, and also that they shouldn't have been quite as careless with some of the funding as they were. But then when you're talking about the education department, I think the stakes are even higher because it's much, much closer to home for your average voter, your average American.
Yeah, and the education department, in addition to funding things like Pell Grants, which is really important for lower income students to be able to go to college. In terms of the local public school system, they're primarily involved, number one, in poor school districts where you have a disproportionate number of kids who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. So if you meet this designation, you get additional funding from the federal government. That's really significant in states. Actually, it's most significant if you look by the numbers. It's more significant in red states than in blue states. A lot of southern states where this Title I funding is really important. The other place where federal government funding becomes extremely important is for students with disabilities. And that's a wide range of those sorts of services that are, public schools are required to be able to provide, everything from, speech therapy to sort of more intensive interventions. And that funding also is, distributed from the federal government and obviously is really, really critical to millions upon millions of families in this country. I mean, I have kids who went through speech therapy and, have benefited from these programs, and many families across the country do. So when you start messing with those sorts of things, yeah, you're gonna, this is not politically popular. Like if you ask people, should you spend more or less money on education, you're gonna get a resounding response, say 70%, that say we should be spending more money actually on education, not less. And so, if this could really be one of the things that touches communities, and especially rural communities, especially in poor states, across the country, including many red states. I mean, again, we saw with the teacher strike wave that was places like West Virginia, places like Kentucky, places like Arizona actually was another place. Oklahoma had a significant movement as well. These were a lot of red states where there was a huge backlash because the public school was important to them. So I think you're right, Emily, if it can be sold as like now your local government is gonna have more control and your funding is gonna stay the same, maybe they can sell that politically. But if there starts to be a sense of like, oh, our schools are gonna be under-resourced now because of this attack, I think that hits very different than perhaps conservatives are expecting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Krystal, let's move on to the big news out of Congress, where that massive shutdown spending bill, or the spending bill to avert the shutdown, I should say, passed last night by a thin margin.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.